The screaming stopped at dawn. Margaret Prescott pressed her face against the cold barn wood, watching the last wisps of smoke curl from what had been her family's ranch house. The acrid smell of charred timber mixed with something else, something that made bile rise in her throat. Through the gaps between the boards she could see boots, her father's boots, still and twisted at an unnatural angle. Maggie. The whisper came from behind her, barely audible above the wind that swept down from the Bighorn Mountains. Her younger sister Grace, 19 and trembling like a newborn colt, clutched baby Sarah to her chest. At barely 2 years old, Sarah was mercifully silent, her blue eyes wide with the kind of confusion that would, in time, become blessing. "They're gone," Margaret whispered back, her voice catching on the words like barbed wire. She was 23, the eldest, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than the Winchester rifle she'd grabbed before fleeing to the barn. All of them. The Dalton gang had ridden hard through the Wyoming Territory that October of 1887, leaving a trail of blood and burned dreams. The Prescott ranch had been prosperous, too prosperous perhaps, for their own good. Their father had struck silver in the creek that wound through their land, and word had spread faster than wildfire through the saloons and gambling halls of Cheyenne. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to shut out the memory of her mother's face in that final moment, the way she'd pushed Grace and the baby toward the back door while the outlaws kicked in the front, the way she'd smiled, even as the fear in her eyes spoke of her certain death. "What do we do now?" Grace's voice was small, lost. Margaret turned from the window, her jaw set with a determination that masked the terror threatening to consume her. In the pale morning light filtering through the barn slats, she looked older than her years. Her auburn hair escaped from its braid, and her calico dress torn and stained with dirt and worse things. "We run," she said simply. "We run, and we survive." The general store in Buffalo Creek sat like a lonely gravestone against the endless Wyoming sky. Margaret had ridden hard for 3 days, Grace and baby Sarah clinging to her like shadows, their horse half dead beneath them. They'd sold their mother's jewelry for supplies and a sturdy wagon, keeping only their mother's wedding ring and their father's rifle. The town was typical of the territory, a collection of weathered wood buildings struggling against the wind, populated by hard men and harder women trying to carve life from unforgiving land. Margaret sat on the wagon bench, studying the faces of the men who'd answered her posted notice. She needed help. 3 women alone in the wilderness were as good as dead, especially with winter coming, and nowhere to go but up into the mountains where her uncle's abandoned mining claim waited. The claim was their only hope, a chance to start over where no one would think to look for them. 3 men had come. The first was Thomas Whitmore, a quiet man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that seemed familiar even though she'd never seen him before. "A buffalo hunter," he'd said, "looking for winter work." Something in the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken in a way that felt both dangerous and necessary. The second was Solomon Pierce, a black man whose freedom papers were worn soft from folding and unfolding. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading his beard despite being no older than 40. An ex-slave from Alabama, he'd drifted west after the war, following dreams of land and liberty. His eyes held depths of pain that Margaret recognized, the look of someone who'd lost everything and found the strength to keep breathing. The third was Joseph Running Wolf, a Cheyenne warrior, whose people had been scattered to the winds by the cavalry. He was young, maybe 25, with braided black hair and eyes like flint that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. He spoke little English, but his presence felt like a promise. Dangerous, perhaps, but solid as mountain stone. "You understand what I'm asking," Margaret said to the 3 men standing before her wagon. Grace sat behind her, Sarah sleeping in her arms, both of them wrapped in their mother's quilt. "It's hard country up there. Winter's coming early this year, and there's no telling what we'll find." Thomas stepped forward slightly, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, I've spent 5 winters in the mountains. I can hunt, I can build, and I can fight if need be." Solomon nodded slowly. "Miss, I've been looking for a place to make a stand, somewhere a man can work honest and be left alone. I can do carpentry, blacksmithing, whatever needs doing." Joseph said nothing, but his slight nod spoke volumes. "Why?" Margaret asked, studying each face in turn. "Why would you help us?" The question hung in the cold air like breath made visible. Thomas looked down at his boots, then back up at her with something raw in his expression. "Lost my own family to cholera 3 years back. Wife and 2 little ones. A man gets tired of being alone." Solomon's voice was quiet but steady. "Some debts can't be paid with money, miss. Sometimes a man owes something to the future instead of the past." Joseph spoke for the first time, his English careful but clear. "My people say a warrior's strength is measured by what he protects, not what he destroys." Grace whispered something Margaret couldn't hear, but she felt her sister's hand touch her shoulder, a small gesture of trust and encouragement. "Wages are slim," Margaret said finally. "Share of whatever we can make work up there, food and shelter, and whatever protection we can offer each other. That's more than fair," Thomas said. They loaded their meager possessions and started up the mountain trail that afternoon. Margaret walked beside the wagon, her father's rifle across her back, watching the three men who'd agreed to stake their lives on the word of a desperate woman. Thomas led the way, reading the trail like a book written in stone and shadow. Solomon walked beside the oxen, his strong hands ready to help when the path grew steep. Joseph ranged ahead and behind, a silent guardian whose presence made the vast wilderness feel less empty. As the sun set behind the peaks and the first snow began to fall, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since that terrible dawn: hope. Winter came early and stayed late in the Bighorn Mountains. By November, the abandoned mining claim looked less like salvation and more like a beautiful grave. The cabin Uncle Henry had built was solid enough, but small. 2 rooms for 6 people, with winds that howled down from the peaks like the voices of the damned. But they worked. Thomas proved worth 3 men, hunting elk and deer while teaching Margaret to read the weather in the color of the sky. His hands were as gentle with baby Sarah as they were sure with an axe or rifle, and Margaret found herself watching the way he moved through the world, quiet, careful, respectful of the life around him. Solomon transformed the tiny lean-to shed into a proper workshop, forging tools from scrap metal and building furniture from fallen timber. His deep voice singing spirituals filled the long evenings, harmonizing with Grace's sweet soprano in songs that made the cabin feel less like exile and more like home. Joseph taught them all to read the language of the mountains, which plants could heal and which could kill, how to find water under ice, how to move through snow without leaving tracks that would lead enemies to their door. He rarely spoke, but his actions spoke volumes, especially the way his eyes lingered on Grace when he thought no one was looking. December brought blizzards that lasted for days, trapping them all in the small cabin where relationships deepened in the forced intimacy of survival. Margaret found herself drawn to Thomas in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. He was nothing like the carefully mannered gentleman who'd courted her back when she'd been a rancher's daughter with prospects. He was real in a way that made her feel more alive than she'd ever been. Grace bloomed under Joseph's quiet attention, learning to speak simple phrases in Cheyenne while he learned to read English from her father's Bible. Solomon carved toys for Sarah and told stories of his boyhood in Alabama that made them all forget for moments that they were fugitives from their own lives. It was Christmas Eve when Thomas kissed her. They'd been checking the horses in the lean-to stable Solomon had built, the snow falling so thick outside that the world beyond the door had disappeared entirely. Thomas was adjusting the blanket on Margaret's mare when she stumbled slightly on the icy ground. His hands caught her, steady and warm, and suddenly they were standing close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Margaret," he said softly, her name like a prayer on his lips. She should have stepped away, should have remembered that she was a woman with responsibilities, that he was a man she was paying for work, that the world had rules about such things. Instead, she lifted her face to his and felt his lips meet hers with a gentleness that made her heart race. When they broke apart, both breathing hard in the cold air, he touched her face with fingers rough from work but tender with care. "I didn't mean," he started. "I did," she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. They stood there in the hay-scented dimness, snow whispering against the walls, and Margaret felt something she'd thought died with her family, the possibility of joy. Spring brought more than melting snow. It brought visitors. Margaret was hanging laundry behind the cabin when Joseph came running down from his watch post on the ridge above them, his face grim with urgency. "Riders coming," he said in his careful English. "Many riders. They fly no flag." The Dalton gang had found them. Thomas appeared from the mine shaft where he'd been helping Solomon shore up the entrance to the silver vein they'd discovered. His rifle was already in his hands, and his face had gone hard as granite. "How many?" he asked Joseph. 8, maybe 10. They know where we are." Margaret's blood turned to ice water. How? How could they know? No one answered, but the question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. They had perhaps an hour before the riders reached the cabin. Grace gathered baby Sarah and their few valuables while the men checked weapons and planned their defense. The cabin was well positioned, built into a natural depression in the mountainside, with good sightlines down the approach trail, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "There's another way," Solomon said suddenly, his voice heavy with something Margaret couldn't identify. "The old mine shaft runs clear through the mountain. Comes out about 2 miles north of here, near that stand of aspen." Thomas looked up sharply. "You never mentioned that before. Wasn't relevant before." Solomon's eyes wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. "You could get the women and the baby out that way. Get a head start while I hold them here. We're not leaving you," Margaret said firmly. But even as she spoke, she saw the wisdom in his plan. Sarah couldn't survive a running gunfight, and Grace was no fighter. It was Thomas who asked the question that had been growing in Margaret's mind like a poisonous seed. "How did they find us, Solomon?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain, and something else, something that smelled like violence and desperation. Solomon's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled on them. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a pain so deep it made Margaret's chest ache. "They got my papers," he said quietly. "My freedom papers. Had him in a poker game in Cheyenne before I met you folks. Won him back, but he pulled a folded document from his shirt pocket, and Margaret could see even from across the room that it had been tampered with. They wrote on him, added their own message. Thomas stepped forward, his face dangerous. What message? Instructions on where to find you. Promise of a reward. Solomon's voice broke slightly. They've been using me to track you this whole time. Every time I went to town for supplies, I was carrying their message. I didn't know what. I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't know. The betrayal hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd trusted this man with her life, with her sister's lives, with baby Sarah's future. He'd become part of their family, and all the while he'd been leading death to their door. But even as fury rose in her throat, she saw the anguish in Solomon's face, and recognized something else, a different kind of trap, a different kind of prison. The Dalton gang had used his past against him, turned his most precious possession into a weapon against people he'd come to love. You could have told us, Grace said, her voice small but steady. I could have, Solomon nodded. Should have, soon as I figured it out. But I was afraid you'd send me away, and this, he gestured around the small cabin that had become their sanctuary. This is the first real home I've had since the war ended. Joseph stepped forward, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, but his voice was calm. What matters now is what we do next. Through the window, Margaret could see dust rising from the trail below. The riders were closer than expected. Thomas made the decision for all of them. Solomon, you know that mine shaft better than any of us. Can you get the women through safely? Thomas, no, Margaret started, but he cut her off with a look that made her chest tight with fear and love combined. You have to live, he said simply. Whatever else happens, you and Grace and Sarah have to live. That's what your parents would have wanted. It's what I want. Joseph nodded once, sharp and decisive. I will stay with Thomas. We will give you time. This is madness, Grace protested, but she was already moving toward the mine entrance. Sarah clutched tight against her chest. Margaret looked at Thomas, memorizing his face in the lamplight. The gentle eyes that had seen her through the hardest winter of her life, the strong hands that had built their future from nothing, the mouth that had kissed her with such tenderness just months before. I love you, she said, the words coming out fierce and desperate. I love you too, he replied. That's why you have to go. Solomon led them into the darkness of the mine shaft, his lamp casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Behind them, Margaret could hear Thomas and Joseph checking their weapons, preparing to make their stand. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. The mine was cold and wet, water seeping through the mountain stone and pooling in treacherous spots that could turn an ankle or worse. Sarah began to cry, the sound echoing off the walls like the wail of lost spirits. Grace hummed softly to quiet her, the same lullaby their mother had sung. How much farther? Margaret asked Solomon, whose lamp seemed to be growing dimmer with each step. Not far now, he replied, but his voice sounded strange in the confined space. Behind them the first gunshots echoed through the mountain like thunder. Margaret stumbled, caught herself against the rough stone wall, and felt her heart tear in half. Thomas was back there, fighting for their lives, and she was running like a coward through the dark belly of the earth. Keep moving, Solomon urged. We're almost there. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Margaret could feel the first whisper of fresh air on her face when Solomon suddenly stopped. What is it? Grace whispered. Solomon raised his lamp higher, and Margaret saw what had made him pause. The tunnel ahead was blocked by fallen stone, a cave-in that looked recent. When did this happen? Margaret asked, fighting down panic. Solomon was silent for a long moment, studying the rockfall with his lamp held high. Finally he turned to face them, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. About 3 days ago, he said quietly, I sealed it myself. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Margaret stared at the man who'd carved toys for Sarah, who'd sung hymns with Grace, who'd become the brother she'd never had. The man who'd led them into a trap. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Solomon set down his lamp carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. Because some men don't get to choose their redemption, Miss Margaret. Some men are too broken to be fixed. The Dalton gang has your real freedom papers, Margaret said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Never had any real freedom papers, Solomon admitted. Been running from slave catchers and bounty hunters for 15 years. The Daltons caught me in Cheyenne, said they'd turn me over to the authorities unless I helped them find you, said they'd make it worth my while if I played along. Grace stepped back, pressing herself against the tunnel wall, Sarah whimpering in her arms. You led us here to die. No, Solomon said, and there was anguish in his voice. I led you here to live. The cave-in's fresh work, but there's another way out. Smaller tunnel, harder to travel, but it comes out near the river. You can follow the water down to Fort Laramie. Get help. He gestured to a crack in the tunnel wall that Margaret hadn't noticed before, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. What about you? Margaret asked. Solomon smiled sadly. I'm going back. Going to tell the Daltons you got away clean, buy you as much time as I can before they figure out the truth. They'll kill you. Probably. Solomon picked up his lamp again. But I've been dead for 15 years anyway. Maybe it's time to do something that makes it count. Margaret stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd betrayed them with the man who was now offering his life for theirs. Why should we trust you now? Because you don't have a choice, Solomon said simply. And because I've been carrying the weight of what I've done to good people for too long. This is the only way I know to set it right. The sound of gunfire from the cabin had stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the shooting had been. Go, Solomon urged. Thomas and Joseph bought you time with their lives. Don't waste it. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the impossible choices that had led them to this dark place under the mountain. Instead, she kissed Solomon's cheek, a gesture of forgiveness that surprised them both. Take care of each other, he said gruffly, then turned and began walking back toward the block tunnel, and whatever fate waited for him there. Margaret squeezed through the narrow opening first, then helped Grace pass Sarah through before following. The hidden tunnel was barely wide enough for their shoulders, forcing them to move single file through absolute darkness. Water dripped constantly from above, and more than once Margaret felt things scurrying away from their footsteps. After what felt like hours, they emerged into daylight so bright it made their eyes water. They were indeed near the river, with Fort Laramie visible in the distance as a smudge of smoke against the horizon. Grace sank to her knees in the grass, exhausted and shaking. Sarah had finally fallen asleep, her small face peaceful despite everything that had happened around her. What now? Grace asked. Margaret looked back toward the mountains where Thomas and Joseph had made their stand, where Solomon was walking back to face his reckoning with the Dalton gang. Her heart felt like it had been carved out of her chest with a dull knife, leaving only a hollow ache behind. Now we live, she said. We live, and we remember them. We make their sacrifice mean something. 5 years later, Margaret Prescott, now Margaret Whitmore, stood on the porch of the school she'd built in Fort Laramie, watching her students file out into the afternoon sunshine. Grace's daughter Sarah, now 7 years old, ran toward her with a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the world. Aunt Maggie, look what I drew. Sarah held up a paper covered in crayon figures, a family standing in front of a cabin, surrounded by mountains. Tell me about it, sweetheart. That's Mama and me, and that's you and Uncle Thomas, and those are Uncle Solomon and Uncle Joseph. We're all together in the mountains, and nobody's sad anymore. Margaret's throat tightened. Sarah had no memory of that terrible winter, of the mine shaft, or the betrayal, or the men who'd died so she could live. In her child's mind, the men who'd shaped her earliest years were simply part of her family, as real and present as anyone else. It's beautiful, Sarah, just beautiful. The little girl skipped away to play with the other children, and Margaret felt strong arms encircle her from behind. She leaned back against Thomas's chest, still marveling at the miracle of his presence. He'd survived the gunfight at the cabin, though barely. Joseph had died protecting the door, but his sacrifice had given Thomas time to find cover and pick off 3 of the Dalton gang members before the rest retreated. Solomon had never returned to face them. His body had been found a week later at the bottom of a ravine, whether by accident or design, no one could say. The surviving members of the Dalton gang had been captured by the cavalry and hanged in Cheyenne. The threat that had driven the Prescott sisters into exile was finally ended. How was school today? Thomas asked, his breath warm against her ear. Good. Sarah's reading improves every day. Grace says she wants to be a teacher when she grows up. Like her aunt. Margaret smiled. Grace had married a young cavalry officer from the fort 2 years ago and was expecting her second child. She'd found happiness with a gentle man who understood that some stories were too painful to share and some silences were sacred. Thomas, Margaret said suddenly, turning in his arms to face him. Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing, letting Sarah think they're all still with us somehow? Thomas considered the question seriously, as he considered everything. I think, he said finally, that love doesn't end just because someone dies. Solomon redeemed himself in the end, gave his life for yours. Joseph died protecting what mattered most to him. That kind of love, it changes a person. It changes the world. Margaret nodded, understanding flooding through her like sunlight after storm. They're still with us, aren't they? In every choice we make, every kindness we show, every time we choose to trust instead of fear, every time Sarah laughs, every student you teach to read, every day Grace wakes up happy. That's their legacy living on. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace appeared around the corner of the schoolhouse, her pregnant belly preceding her like a promise of the future. Her husband John walked beside her, steady and devoted, Sarah skipping between them like a bridge connecting past and future. The sunset's going to be beautiful tonight, Grace called out. Come have dinner with us. Margaret looked at the family she'd helped save, the community she'd helped build, the man whose love had anchored her through the worst storms of her life. She thought of her parents, buried in Wyoming soil but living on in the strength they'd given their daughters. She thought of Solomon, whose betrayal had become sacrifice, and Joseph, whose warrior's heart had beat for love instead of war. Love transcends all boundaries, she whispered, quoting the words Thomas had spoken at their wedding. What's that? He asked. Nothing, she smiled, taking his hand. Everything. Come on, let's go home. As they walked toward Grace's house, Sarah ran back to take Margaret's free hand. chattering about her drawing, and her dreams, and all the tomorrows that stretched ahead of them like an endless prairie under an infinite sky. Behind them the mountains stood eternal and patient, holding their secrets and their sorrows, their betrayals and their redemptions. The wind that swept down from the peaks carried the whisper of voices, Solomon's deep bass harmonizing with Joseph's quiet strength, her parents' laughter mixing with the echo of gunshots and promises kept. Margaret squeezed Thomas's hand and Sarah's small fingers, feeling the connections that bound them all together, the living and the dead, the betrayers and the redeemed, the lost and the found. Love had indeed transcended every boundary that had tried to contain it, transforming tragedy into hope, strangers into family, and a desperate flight into the wilderness, into the foundation of a life worth living. The last light of day painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful as a promise, eternal as the human heart's capacity to love beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond even death itself.